Topic 6 is proteins and amino acids. And I love proteins and amino acids. Again, my biochemistry background, I have spent so much time working with proteins and amino acids, and there's so much to say. We're going to get right into this and focus in on some nutritional aspects of them, but I really do enjoy learning about proteins and amino acids. So we had talked about proteins a little bit way back in topic 1, and I think it said some vague things in terms of them being kind of the main building blocks of the body. And that's a pretty good description about what proteins do. You can see there's a list of a few things: muscles, tendons, enzymes, neurotransmitters, blood clotting. You could make a massive list of all the things proteins do, and we're going to go through a few of these today. So they're very, very, very important. Obviously, like all the nutrients, they're essential, and so we want to get in and talk about these. You can see what the DRI is, about 10 to 35% of your daily calories, 10% being the minimum. Most Canadians are, I think, closer to 17 or 25%. Some people are over that 35%, believe it or not. So again, and this is one of these things that recommended percentage really does depend on what's going on in your life. Are you a child? Are you a baby? Are you pregnant? Are you sick with some sort of disease and you need healing? Are you injured? Are you working out? Are you sedentary? All these things will change in terms of your actual protein need. So that's where that 10% comes in. That covers kind of most people. Some people that's on the lower end, particularly people who are working out extensively, elite athletes and pregnant women and children are other areas that tend to usually need a little bit more protein. So let's talk a little bit about the roles of proteins and what they're doing. There's a massive list here, and I'm not going to get into these things in a ton of detail, but I do want to kind of go through them just to highlight their importance. And some of the importance of proteins are things that we've talked about or will be talking about in this course. So we've talked a little bit about enzymes. We talked about salivary amylase. We talked about lipases. We talked about lactase. So all of these are enzymes that are involved in breaking food down. And so most enzymes are proteins, and a massive part of our body and a massive part of just the function of our body. So just a little bit about what an enzyme is. An enzyme is a catalyst. So that means it is something that facilitates and speeds up chemical reactions. So if you take a look at the image here, it's showing you've got these two chemicals, A and B, right? And A and B here are going to be joined together and make a new chemical, and many chemical reactions are super, super slow. So you can imagine this hypothetical chemical, it might actually take 1,000 years to do so. But with the enzyme, we're talking about milliseconds. And that's actually a good example of an enzyme is something called sucrase. So maybe I'll write that one down here. So sucrase is an enzyme, and what it does is it takes sucrose, there we go, and it breaks it down into glucose and fructose. So that particular reaction, if you have sucrose dissolved in a glass of sterile water, the reaction will actually take years. It is very, very, very slow, but milliseconds with the enzyme. So we don't have time, right? If we want to eat a meal today and get the energy today, we have to have enzymes, and they actually facilitate most of the chemical reactions in our body. So massively important. So lots of roles of proteins. I have this little graphic here from a different textbook that's showing some of the roles, and there's a few that our textbook is listed as well. And I kind of want to just, like I said, touch on a few of these things. So you can see number 2 is defensive proteins, such as antibodies. These are part of our immune system. They're there for binding invaders, part of our adaptive immune system, and very, very important. Without antibodies, without that part of your immune system, you basically have to live in a plastic bubble, or else you'll get infections and die. You can look that one up. It's called SCIDS, or bubble boy disease, and a very, very severe disease. We already talked a little bit about lipoproteins. So HDL and LDL And these are proteins involved in these little carrier molecules. There's also phospholipids in there, and they carry things like triglycerides and cholesterol, and the lipoproteins are part of that structure to hold things together and facilitate those lipoproteins. Some proteins are involved in your membranes, and they are transporting things in and out. So we were talking about food getting absorbed in the intestine, right? So for example, we have a meal of starch, and the starch gets broken down into glucose. Well, the glucose can't just enter the cells without these transport proteins. And most of our food getting into our intestinal cells and into cells of our body are reliant on these transporters. Your neurons are reliant on these transport proteins for allowing ions in and out, and that's part of the nerve impulse. Some of our proteins are hormones. So we talked about insulin and glucagon. So insulin, glucagon as being two hormone proteins. Not all hormones are proteins, by the way. We did talk about steroids. They are not proteins, they're lipids, but many proteins, or many hormones are proteins as well, insulin and glucagon being the most relevant for this class. Some proteins are receptors, so they're receiving signals. You can see that's a neuron, and receiving signals from, maybe a neuron is giving a signal to a muscle cell to contract. Many of our proteins are structural. It's worth mentioning this one in particular. This structural protein is collagen. So collagen, if you take a look at the picture here, kind of is a rope-like structure. And this is found something like 60 or 70% of the protein in your body is collagen. So you're probably wondering, okay, where is this stuff? Well, it's in your skin, it's in your bones, your teeth. It's basically what is making up connective tissue all around your body. It's kind of it's got a little bit of elasticy kind of properties to it, and that allows your skin to have a little bit of bounce to it. I've heard, and I don't really understand how this procedure works, is that you can get collagen injections for cosmetic purposes. So some people want to have fuller lips and things like that, and I think that's what's in them. Not 100% sure about that, but like I said, it gives your body a little bit of bounce and stretch to it. And really, really important. And this is the protein that sort of breaks down if you have scurvy. So if you have a vitamin C deficiency, you might have bleeding in your gums and teeth, and your skin is more brittle and whatnot. And this is the protein that is directly affected by vitamin C deficiency. A big part of the protein in our body is muscle. And that's what this is talking about, contractile proteins and motor proteins. Motor proteins are basically mean proteins that can move, and they take energy, and that, of course, describes our muscles. And the two proteins that are the majority of your muscle are these two ones here, actin and myosin, and they're very interesting how they work together. Keep going on. Like I said, it goes on and on why proteins are important. Growth and maintenance. What does this mean? It means that, well, obviously, if you're growing, that makes sense. You're a smaller human and you're trying to become a bigger human. Maybe you're a child or something like that. But even as adults, we are continually recycling our cells. Where some of them, they just get old. We have to break them down, and this is a process called protein turnover. And we're looking at in a human adult. I was just looking at this number, and apparently 300 to 400 grams of protein in your body is turned over every day. So that means the protein is broken down into its parts, its amino acids, and basically recycled. So maybe about 10 to 20% of our actual energy in a day is involved in growth and maintenance. Building other compounds. So the amino acids, we'll talk about amino acids shortly, but they're often used as building blocks to synthesize other things. For example, the amino acid tyrosine is used to make adrenaline. And there's many, many other examples of amino acids being used to build other chemical compounds. Not going to get into that one a ton. Maintaining fluid and electrolyte balance. So there are proteins in your body that absorb moisture. They absorb water, and if they don't do their job properly, sometimes you get edema, which is a kind of rash, and your cells have to have liquid in them, not liquid pouring out of them, and so there's a lot of that I could go into. It would kind of be a long lecture, and I'm not going to say much more about that. There's a paragraph on it in the textbook you can read about. But I think the bottom line is proteins are doing a lot of things. Maintaining acid and base balance. We have something called buffers in our blood. Our blood has to be maintained at a very strict pH level, usually around 7.4, and it's rigidly controlled by the body. And if you don't, you might have something called acidosis or alkalosis, which means your body is getting too acidic or too basic, and that can result to severe health issues, coma, or death. And there are proteins involved in that process. Blood clotting, we have proteins in our blood that clot, and if your blood does not clot, when you cut or scratch yourself, you will bleed and you will not stop bleeding. It's a really big deal. Again, a really fascinating process that's worth looking into if you're interested in these things. Blood clotting is really, really cool. So another thing, big one, maybe this one should have been number one, is providing energy. So we do eat proteins to give us amino acid to build more proteins, but any surplus proteins can be used to convert to energy. And so the amount of energy is similar to that you'd find in carbohydrates, so 4 calories per gram. And that's a good thing, right? We like energy. The nitrogen here, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, usually gets converted into something called urea, and the urea gets excreted in the urine. And so it's not, this is good. We can also use amino acids, and we can use it to synthesize glucose. So remember, we were talking about how glucose is essential for your brain. And if you're not consuming enough carbohydrates, we can't actually make it from fat. We can make it from protein though. And so this is really important for the brain to have a mechanism to make glucose. If we do consume too much protein, we can, of course, take this and we can convert it to fats. So the glucose, by the way, can get converted to glycogen for your brain and your liver. Any excess energy can get converted to fats and for energy storage for later. So it's kind of the same old story, right? We want glucose for our brain. Extra energy can get converted to glycogen or fats. And could be any energy source. It could be a carbohydrate, could be a protein, could be a fat. Like I said, really the same story. Okay, so that's kind of a whirlwind tour of what proteins do. So a whole bunch of things, right? Some of the key ones to remember are enzymes, a source of amino acids, and a source of energy. Those, I would say, are kind of the top 3. All the other ones are things we'll kind of, touched on, or we will touch on a little bit here or there over the semester. So I want to talk now about what a protein is. Protein is another organic molecule, and it is made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So if you take a look down there at the bottom, there's a little amino acid there, and I can draw one here for you. It kind of looks like this. You've got carbon in the middle, and you can see on the left we have something here, NH2. This is an amine group. And so that's where the name amino acid comes from, because an amine group becomes an amino when it's attached to something. Over on the other side, we have something called a carboxylic acid. It looks something like this. And so we have an amino group, we have an acid group, and it becomes an amino acid. They all have a little hydrogen attached to it, which nobody ever talks about. But the other thing we have down here, notice it's labeled with an R. It's a side chain. Now, the big question is, why is it labeled an R? Why do we have it an R? Well, it turns out in the periodic table of elements in chemistry, there is no element that is an R. So it's kind of one of those letters that's left over. And so chemists kind of use it to say that it could be anything. And it isn't necessarily just anything. It turns out for the amino acids, there are 20 options. And I'll show you those in a second. And I'm not expecting people to draw an amino acid or anything like that. I think in terms of the chemistry, this is kind of good to know that it has carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And it's good to know that there's 20 different amino acids, and they have very different chemical properties. And I'll show you, here's the 20 amino acids. And so at least a few times in my life, I had all these structures memorized. I could probably still draw quite a few of them by memory. And they're very important to biochemistry and cell biology, which is something I've done a lot of. And like I said, you can see there's 20 of them. And what you're seeing here, again, if you don't have any chemistry background, that's okay. But I'm just trying to show you that they have different properties, and you can see they're grouped into 4 categories, something called nonpolar. So nonpolar usually means hydrophobic, which means not water soluble. So that has one property. All the ones here on the right, the polar ones, the charged ones, are all water soluble. And polar is different from charged as well. So like I said, there's different ways to kind of group these things in terms of their chemical properties. But the reality is you have 20 amino acids and all have different chemical properties. Some are more similar to what, others. Some are all, non-polar, some are polar and whatnot. So that's kind of the first thing to note. 20 different amino acids. So we have very versatile molecules, and you could probably see that from what we said in terms of proteins are very versatile. There's a lot of things that they can actually do. Another thing to take from this is that it turns out that some of these are what we call essential amino acids. So there are 9 of them, 9 essential or indispensable, you can use either term, amino acids. So these are things that the body cannot make on its own or doesn't make them enough, like too slowly. To meet its needs. So these are ones that we have to have in our diet. So you can see the names of them: valine, leucine, isoleucine, methionine, tryptophan, phenylalanine, threonine, lysine, and histidine. So we have to get those in our diet, and that's going to be really important for what we're going to talk about later. There are some amino acids that fall into a second category that are called conditionally essential. So these ones here are not necessarily essential. Our body can make them, but often we have to make them out of one of the essential ones. So I'll give you an example. Phenylalanine. So phenylalanine can be used to make tyrosine. But if you're not getting enough phenylalanine in your diet, then tyrosine is essential in your diet. So these are the ones that are kind of like, okay, yeah, it's probably a good idea to have a little bit of them in your diet because your body can make them. But again, it really just depends on what your diet is. And again, it really has to do with, it's a good idea to have a variety in our diet. Like I said, I'm not going to really talk about the specific nuances of all the different amino acids. Some of the names might come up again here or there. You can see a lot of them end up with ine. So if you see something that ends up with INE, there's a good chance it might be an amino acid. And there's a few others that you may have heard of. Tryptophan is associated with turkeys and things like that, and maybe we'll talk about that in a later lecture. So some more language for you in terms of amino acids and proteins, okay? So you can see they're showing some amino acids there, just shown by these little bubble structures. And one of the terminologies that you might see is when you join these things together, they're joined together with something called a peptide bond. So this is the peptide bond. And when you get a strand of amino acids, often the term that is used is called a peptide. And that usually means a strand of a few amino acids. So what is a few? Doesn't really matter. More than one. So the term peptide is though usually used for short strands. So anywhere from about, let's say, 2 to 30 is the typical. If you have something like this here, notice this one is 3. So we might call this a tripeptide because there are 3 amino acids. If you have many, then we could call this a polypeptide. Or just a protein. So just keep in mind that these type of words are kind of used interchangeably. Peptide, polypeptide, protein, they all mean a string of amino acids is what I'm trying to get at here. So want to just talk a little bit about how these things come together and make proteins. Very fascinating process. I took some advanced courses in my PhD on this kind of protein structure, which is just really fascinating stuff. But at a very basic level, what you have are these amino acids. And the amino acid code, the order that you put them in, by the way, is in your genetic code. These are your genes. These are what your genes are telling your body to do. They're saying, put alanine, then lysine, then proline, then valine, then glutamic acid, and so on. That is what your genes do. So at a very basic level, your genes dictate your amino acid sequences. And so these amino acids are then put together at a structure called a ribosome, and they're going to make a peptide. And these peptides have the amino acids have different chemical properties, and they're going to basically they're going to organize themselves together in a three-dimensional structure called a protein. And you can see this one here is showing this protein here seems to have a little bit of a spiral shape to it. And then you end up with something that you would call the final folded structure. So I have over there on the right the folded structure of salivary amylase. And you can see that they're trying to represent the final folded structure as they're not going to show you all the atoms. It would just be a big blob of little circles. But they're trying to show you that there's a fold to it. And some of the structures are kind of helical in shape. Some of them are more linear and so on. And you have a final functional enzyme. So it's pretty cool. There's a whole variety of different types of folds, and they have some pretty cool names like an alpha beta sandwich and things like that. Makes me hungry thinking about them. There's also a jelly roll fold, I believe it's called, as well. But there's literally thousands of different protein structures. And it's worth it to note that some proteins, you have to actually have multiple proteins to get the final structure. And I already showed you collagen. Collagen is the one here on the left. And I had mentioned it is kind of like a rope, and it has three strands, three peptide strands are wrapped around each other to make this rope-like structure. There's another example there on the right, hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is 4 proteins. They're all called globulin proteins, and they basically attach to one another in something that we call a tetramer. Tetra means 4. And there's 4 of them together. And hemoglobin, if you don't know what hemoglobin carries oxygen. It picks it up in your lungs and brings that oxygen over to your tissues. And this is the thing that is in your blood that is red because it has iron in it. And iron is, of course, red in color. Another thing you might notice with hemoglobin is that some proteins have other things attached to them. So the iron, as I just mentioned, is attached to this. So there's iron labeled there. This is the red part. Some of them have other things, such as vitamins or things derived from vitamins. So hemoglobin also has heme. I can't remember what heme is derived from. It might be niacin, which is one of the B vitamins. And these are essential for making the whole thing functional. I was going to say a couple other things about hemoglobin here, and just in terms of protein structure. I'm trying to remember what they are. Maybe I'll have it on a future slide. Oh yes, kind of going back to our genetics. I just wanted to mention that there's obviously a variety of humans on the planet in terms of their genetics, right? Some of us have blue eyes, some of us have brown eyes, and things like that. And all of these things are in our gene sequences, which ultimately code to amino acid sequences. And sometimes, unfortunately for people, sometimes our genetics leave us with genetic diseases or deficiencies and things like that. And I just wanted to show you one here that is featured in the textbook, and it's a really well understood genetic disease. It's called sickle cell anemia. If you take a look at this, we're looking at a 1 amino acid change right here. And I actually have a better slide. I'm going to just skip to that one here to show you what is going on here. So if you take a look, they're showing on the left here the sequence of the amino acids, and we're looking at amino acid number 6, where a glutamic acid, that's a charged amino acid, is changed to a hydrophobic amino acid called valine. And so if you look at the protein on the top, we're looking at, this is our normal hemoglobin, right? And so you have the four subunits attaching together, and they're floating around, binding oxygen, and they're sitting around in your red blood cells. And that's what your normal red blood cell looks like. Now, the mutated one, it still can bind oxygen, not quite as efficiently, but unfortunately, it has this little hydrophobic component to it. And from a chemical structure, you probably know that hydrophobic things like oil does not mix with water. What does oil do when you add it to water? It clumps, right? And so now these little proteins, they clump together, and they actually form fibers inside the cells. And the fibers kind of, they have a little bit of an arch shape to them. And what you end up is something called a sickle cell. So sickle, by the way, is one of these tools that would be used by a farmer, or you might see the Grim Reaper with a sickle. And so that's where the name is from that. So protein structure can matter and very, very much. You can learn about sickle cell disease. It's called sickle cell anemia because these cells, they break open, and these people don't have enough red blood cells, and they can have pain in the extremities, and there's a whole variety of symptoms. It's a pretty nasty genetic disorder. So kind of on that same topic of, if you have a protein sequence incorrect, you can also destroy proteins. And the term for destroying a protein is called denaturation. And this can be done by heat, by pH, by chemicals. There's a variety of ways to do this. And there's a lot of different contexts on protein denaturation. For example, if you have ever used hand sanitizer, that is one of the things you're trying to do, is you're trying to denature membranes and proteins using that ethanol. In terms of digestion of things, this is what our stomach is trying to do, is denature foods so that we can break them down and consume them. So if you take a look at this, this is showing this diagram. You can see that we've got a folded protein and a denatured protein. So this is something that we might do, for example, when we cook food as well. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's one way to release nutrients. You can see on the left there, I've got an egg. It has proteins in it. And when you denature it, the proteins, they become unraveled and they kind of stick together, and the egg becomes less liquidy and more gelatinous, I guess you could call it. Okay. Yeah, and just another side note. Again, I find this stuff super fascinating. There are quite a number of human diseases that basically are the result of denatured or improperly folded proteins. You can see some of them are listed there: mad cow disease, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. I'm not going to get into all the nature of these. Some of these are chemically induced, some of them are genetically induced, and so on. But very fascinating area of research. Okay, so what I want to do now is we want to talk about protein digestion. Okay, and I'll make some notes like I had done before. This diagram here I found on the internet. I thought it was a pretty good kind of summary of what is going on. But as usual, we're going to start up at the mouth. So we'll start off up at the mouth right here. And so what's going on up at the mouth? The mouth is mostly mechanical breakdown. We don't have any enzymes in the mouth that break down proteins, but it's a good idea to chew these things because, of course, if you have a bite of steak or chicken or something like that, that's a pretty big clump of nutrients. And much of it won't actually get digested unless you chew it pretty decently. Otherwise, it'll just sit in the stomach and have a hard time breaking down. So the mechanical breakdown is very important. All right, so what goes on in the stomach? This is actually a pretty major area of, or at least the beginning area of protein breakdown. So notice we have two things, right, that is listed in this diagram: acid and something called pepsin. So the acid is hydrochloric acid, by the way. And the stomach, by the way, is very, very acidic. I can't remember the exact pH. I think it's a 2. if you know anything about acids, that's enough that if you've got that on your skin, I would be worried, by the way. So it's pretty strong. And so this is what begins the digestion. And what does the acid do? The acid denatures proteins. So if you think about the folding, it kind of just unfolds them. And this allows the digestive enzymes to kind of get at all the strands because they're not tightly packed anymore. So the denatures, and maybe I could say denatures and we'll say uncoils. And uncoils the proteins. There we go. We also have an enzyme in there. So pepsin. So pepsin is an enzyme. Notice it doesn't end up with A's. It was kind of discovered relatively early historically before we started naming enzymes with A's. So it has its own name. So this begins the digestion. So we'll just say it cuts into smaller peptides. So at this point, by smaller peptides, I mean a normal protein could have anywhere from 200 to, let's say, 2,000 amino acids. And this is cutting them into, maybe groups of 30 or 50 amino acids or something like that. It's just kind of, an initial digestion is what is going on. Okay, so the stomach, not a ton going on there, although for proteins, it's a good start compared to the other macromolecules. Proteins kind of get the most going on in the stomach, partly because they are very difficult to digest in some ways. But it's the small intestine, so small intestine, where the majority of digestion for all of your nutrients occurs. So there's a whole bunch of things going on in there. First of all, we have enzymes. And the enzymes, you can see from the diagram, are called peptidases. There's a whole bunch of them out there. The most famous ones are called trypsin and chymotrypsin. And these basically break these things down into, we'll put a note there. So break down. So these, we'll break them down into sometimes amino acids, but mostly we're looking at dipeptides. Dipeptides, tripeptides, and we'll say some amino acids. Got to understand these peptidases are kind of specific for the amino acids that they're cutting. So some of them they can get kind of a hold of and some of them they can't. And so that's why you end up with a variety of different components. There are other peptidases in the gut. You can look them up. Some of them are called proteases and things like that if you want. But trypsin and chymotrypsin are kind of the ones that usually come up in the list. Okay, so the enzymes are down there in the intestine. We also have intestinal cells. Intestinal cells. And what do? They absorb the peptides. Absorb peptides. So by peptides, I mean the dipeptides and tripeptides and amino acids. And what they do is they're going to break them down into individual amino acids. So break into amino acids. Now, some of the ones are amino acids already. Those ones are fine. But the peptides and the dipeptides and tripeptides are broken into individual amino acids, and then they're transferred to the bloodstream, right? So we can say that the last thing. The last thing here, transfer to the bloodstream. And that was my last note. So just enough space on there on the slide. A couple other things we could say about these, right, is that some amino acids are absorbed easier than other amino acids. It turns out that there's different, we were just talking about the functions of proteins, and we have these membrane transporters, and the membrane transporters, there's different ones for different amino acids. and different ones for different types of peptides and tripeptides. I don't really know a lot about them in terms of, I think some of them are mostly just receiving hydrophobic ones, some are specific for individual amino acids and so on. And that can be that can be altered by, their efficiency can be altered by your diet as well, which is something we're going to kind of get into a little bit later. Yeah, so I'll show you some more pictures kind of regarding this. I'll show you the one from the textbook as well. But like I said, you can think about this as 3 stages. We've got the mouth, the stomach, and the small intestine. So the mouth, mechanical, the stomach unravels things with the acid and starts the trimming process with the pepsin. And then the small intestine breaks things down into mostly dipeptides and tripeptides. Those are further broken down into individual amino acids in the intestinal cells before transferred to the bloodstream. And then the body is going to do some good things with it. The last thing to notice here is, of course, where do those enzymes come from? They come from the pancreas. Pancreas produces all sorts of proteins and enzymes for the digestive processes. So there's a little diagram showing your some dipeptides and tripeptides being broken down into individual amino acids. So there's the image from the textbook, and kind of just summarizes what I said in some different words. And again, not much going on in the large intestine. The large intestine, remember, is mostly there to reabsorb water, and it will absorb small amounts of carbohydrates, and that's kind of mostly what it does. Before forming the feces, which is expelled from the body. Okay, so next thing to talk about is what is going to happen to these amino acids now. By the way, I think I forgot to add this slide the other day. I posted the notes last week, the first part for proteins, and I think this slide somehow didn't make it in. I have now since then posted the complete set of notes for this topic, and the slide is in there now. So some of you, if you're following at home on your own PowerPoint, you may not necessarily be seeing this one here. But sorry about that. So what's happening in amino acids? A whole bunch of things, right? And let's kind of go through this list. Number 1, amino acids can be used to build proteins. So your cells are making enzymes, muscle cells are making muscle proteins, your neurons are making neurotransmitters and neurotransmitter receptors, your membranes are making transporters. So proteins are needed all over your body. And so the amino acids can be used to build protein. Some amino acids may be used to make other amino acids. So your essential ones might be used to make some of the non-essential amino acids. And your diet, right? Every day you eat a variety of different things, and sometimes you have a bit more of one thing and a bit less of something else. And your body can do this for some of the amino acids. Just can't make the 9 essential ones. The other thing it can make those amino acids into other essential compounds, usually nitrogen-containing compounds like niacin. Niacin is made from, just trying to remember, I think it might be made from tryptophan, but can't remember that one off the top of my head. But it is synthesized by your body from amino acids. The other big one, as I mentioned, is of course energy. And if you are a typical Canadian getting that 10 to 35%, then that's a certain percentage of your energy that you're getting today is from your protein sources. And of course, if you have excess or if you need glucose or fat, then the proteins can readily be converted to glucose and fat. Remember, the glucose can be used by your cells, particularly your brain likes glucose, or your glucose can also be converted to glycogen, which is just your carbohydrate storage. And again, depending on your meals, right? Think about it. Some people, you have a meal, and maybe for breakfast you had carbohydrates, but for lunch you just had some, let's say, some chicken fingers, right? Not a lot of carbohydrates in there, barely any, in fact. And your body wants glucose. So where's it going to get it from if you haven't eaten in a number of hours? If you haven't eaten any glucose, you make it from the proteins. And of course, fat can be made, and it can also be, fat can be used for energy storage. and not always a bad thing, but we will be talking a lot about that later. Feel like there's something else I was going to say about these amino acids. Just taking a quick look at my notes here. Something that we already kind of talked about, by the way, is that in many cases, when amino acids are used, you're using the carbon part, but the nitrogen part, remember the nitrogen part gets converted to urea, and the urea is excreted in your urine. So that's part of the process there. So that's, you know, kind of like, this is a lot of complex stuff kind of thrown in, and it looks very simple. And each of these things we could expand on in a huge amount of detail, but we're not going to do that. And I think a lot of this makes sense, right? Use amino acids to make proteins, or it can be used for energy. Those are kind of the big two things. Maybe used to make other compounds. Maybe that energy is going to be used in the form of glucose or fats. And that's kind of the common theme, right? Is our food, we can convert it between forms, and it kind of depends on what the body wants or needs. So let's talk a little bit about food. There is a lot of food out there, and we want to talk about protein in food. It's kind of the joke. I don't know what it is lately. It just seems like every soccer mom and everybody out there is concerned about their child getting enough protein. I'm not sure if we need to worry about that, and we'll talk a little bit about you know, protein needs and stuff coming up here shortly. But I saw this infographic here. I thought it was a pretty good one, showing the amount of protein per calorie, right? So if you are looking to get more protein in your diet, that triangle there is a good place. And you may notice that most of those things that are protein-dense foods are animal products. So probably no surprise there. Most of us seem to know if you want protein, you want to get it from animal products. Not always the case, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Not sure how much of that we will get to today, but we'll see how much we cover. Another thing to mention about amino acids is kind of their fate as well. And like I was saying before and alluding to, and we'll get to a bit later, is your actual needs really depends on a variety of things. You know, the size of your body, if you're growing, if you're growing another human, if you're pregnant, if you are healing, you know, those kind of things. And also your body responds differently to different protein sources as well, in terms of digesting and all that. And that's something we'll get into probably next day when we talk a little bit about vegetarians and vegans. I don't think we're going to get to that today. But sometimes you hear in the nutritional literature people talking about wasting protein or wasting amino acids. And what does that mean? I just kind of wanted to talk about that for a moment. So if you think about it, your body's preferred fuel is carbohydrates, right? And anytime we're using proteins as fuel, we're usually converting into glucose first. So if you're eating protein as your main energy source, then you're kind of wasting those amino acids because you're not using them as amino acids. And that's kind of what it means. It's not a big deal. Our body has mechanisms for doing this, and that's a good thing. It's better to eat more protein than you need than not enough, or else you will be malnourished, kind of thing. But that's kind of what that's talking about. So it's kind of worth mentioning. So what about protein powder? This is huge. You know, I was at the gym yesterday and I saw like 3 guys standing there, and they had some sort of bottle, and they were shaking them, standing, talking, and shaking their bottle. So get that image, all 3 of them sitting there shaking, and you know, it was really kind of funny watching these guys. And I figure what they probably have in there is some sort of protein shake. So it's worth it to talk about those things, because these things are hugely popular right now. So first of all, what are they? They're usually some sort of protein source. The number one here is whey. Whey protein, which I'm just trying to remember, is that from milk? Or is casein from milk? I can't remember where whey is from. I have to look that one up. Could be from wheat. But it's basically an extracted protein. And sometimes they have other things in there, a little bit of salt, sometimes some flavor. the 6-star one. I was just trying to look. That's a really popular brand. I think they've got, they've got chocolate peanut butter flavored, and they have caramel flavored. And so often they're trying to make it taste a little bit more desirable. And anyway, like I said, these products have exploded in popularity. I'm seeing people buy them all the time. And so I'll say this about them. They are a source of good protein. And there's, for the most part, nothing wrong with them. Some people may have sensitivities to milk, so they want to avoid certain protein powders and things like that. And they may be a source of good protein if you're not getting it otherwise. I know parents, for example, who like to make smoothies, and their toddler, they're worried about their toddler not getting enough protein, and so put a little protein powder in that smoothie and whatnot. Do we need them? Most of us probably not. Most of us are getting enough protein in our diet. And if you're working out and you're trying to build muscle mass, the best thing you can do to build muscle mass is a proper, rigorous workout. Resistance training. That's how you build muscle mass. There are a few studies on protein powder, and we're talking about studies with elite bodybuilders. And they do show that they can get maybe a 5 to 10% kind of in that range of extra muscle gain. But really, it's the whole program is what they're doing. Most regular bodybuilders are not getting any benefit if they're getting enough protein in their diet. And you can get protein in your diet from eating actual food as well. There's lots of protein in foods. And so most people, this is probably not healthy. Or it might just a little bit. Again, it depends on your program. And building muscles, the number one thing you can do is that strength training, the resistance training. That is what is going to build muscle. Now, there are other components to it, right? Having, good meal before and a meal after. All those kind of things can kind of help the training and the program, and how many days you're working on and off, and which muscles you're working. Those things are, just as important. But like I said, the strength training is how we build muscles. But like I said, usually there's no studies that show really any issues with these things. They've just basically extracted proteins from different sources, added some flavor to it. And if you're concerned about not getting enough protein in your diet, these are great ways to do it. Maybe you're a vegetarian and you're looking for a source of protein without eating animals, right? And so you might want to look at where the different products come from, but not usually a big deal. And can be a good source of protein. But food, on the other hand, right? And I think the protein shakes have a lot to do with marketing. Like, take a look at this here. There's this protein bar, right? And you look at it, and 6 grams of protein in the bar. That's actually not a ton of protein. That's about as much protein as you get from a whole wheat, multi-seed, multi-grain kind of bread, right? So in terms of the value, the bread's a lot cheaper, and in my mind, tastes a lot better. There's protein drinks. Some of them are actually taste pretty good, and some of them are absolutely awful. And often you're paying like $6 for one of these things, right? Whereas a glass of milk is much cheaper and has even more protein in it. So just something to think about, right? Like I said, one of the things I said, I think in the very first lecture, is I said that, learning about food, right? We want to have good food, and eating good food and preparing natural food. That is sometimes one of the better things that people can do, learning how to cook and learning how to use good ingredients, rather than trying to rely on expensive gimmicky drinks and things like that. Now, I have sort of the opposite story to say about amino acid supplements. You can buy particular amino acids, like you can buy lysine, for example. And there's a lot of claims around these kind of things. Now, I'll pick on lysine because, for example, I saw a claim that said lysine can prevent or cure oral or genital herpes. So certainly that's getting people's attention. But I can tell you this, I'm a microbiologist, and I can tell you lysine will not cure herpes. Herpes is a viral disease. You can get antivirals for it, and there is no cure for it either. It is something that is called a lifelong infection, and there's a lot that is known about those viruses. Oral herpes, by the way, is cold sores, and anybody here who has cold sores, that's about 30 to 40% of Canadians, maybe even higher. You know that you're going to live with it for life, and they kind of flare up once in a while, and they don't, and your diet isn't going to affect that. Sorry for the bad news, but like I said, there's a lot of claims around these particular amino acids. I think leucine and valine or something like that have been marketed as going to increase your athletic performance and things like that. Most of these things we just have no idea. Means there's like very little research done on it, and most of the research is anecdotal, meaning that somebody has made the claim and hasn't been put under any rigorous kind of double-blind studies or anything like that. Some of these things can actually give you harm. For example, if you're consuming too much of one amino acid from these supplements, it can actually tie up amino acid transporters and not allow you to absorb other amino acids, at least temporary, right? And there's been some studies that have talked about certain digestive disturbances, so probably constipation or diarrhea is what they mean by that, and disrupt other absorptions. So these kind of things are definitely kind of at that, we don't recommend them. Now, there may be circumstances where people are short because of some sort of disease or deficiency or something like that, and this is where they would be prescribed. There are all sorts of disorders, and in some cases there is a place for supplementing specific amino acids for people with certain medical conditions. But most people should not be walking into the shop and buying these things. Stick with the protein powder, even if it's expensive, it is good protein, and it's probably not going to do any harm, whereas these supplements, in this case here, there are a lot of warnings that go off with them. And it kind of, when you get into the research on these things, it kind of actually sounds pretty scary. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about protein in food and what we need. So this is the recommended is 0.8 grams of good quality protein per kilogram of body weight. So you can see what that equates to, right? So an individual who's about 150 pounds should have about 55 grams of protein, right? So notice what it says here. Most Canadians eat almost double that, and most vegans are getting at least that amount per day. So for Canadians, most of us are eating plenty of protein, and it's not a big deal. Again, it depends on what your diet looks like. And some people, it is a concern getting more into them. Some kids in particular, if anybody here has kids or you're going to have kids, each of them is different. I have kids, and I have one that I think he would have been a vegetarian right from being a baby. He just didn't want to eat meat initially, and that we actually were concerned about him getting enough protein in his diet, and slowly we introduced it and turned him into an omnivore. But we did have a lot of concerns when he was very young, of course, for that particular reason. One of our other kids was the exact opposite. He would have been a carnivore if we had to somehow find a way to get him to eat vegetables. But again, this is something we'll talk about a little bit later on in terms of feeding kids. It's very complicated. You can see this is a little bit more detail on the right, kind of talking about the Canadian Food Guide and saying that meat and plant-based protein foods and milk are all sources of protein. And we'll talk about some of those. So about 10% is kind of the minimum is what you're looking at, right? Per day for Canadians of your food. Now, most of us, this is not a big deal. This is from the textbook, and it's saying that this is about the average for Canadians. So Canadian children are getting about 15%, Canadian adults about 17% of their diet is from protein sources. So like I said, most of us are probably not in good shape in terms of being Canadian, which means we're relatively affluent. Even the poor of us can afford protein quite well. Other parts of the world, not always the case. People can be protein deficient, of course. Something else I had mentioned before is how much protein do people need? Depends on a whole bunch of different factors, right? If you're trying to gain muscle, if you're pregnant, if you are a baby or a child or things like that. It's worth it to, pregnancy, for example, is a very energy and nutrient consumption consumption of energy and nutrients in your body is remarkable, right? If you're pregnant, your fetus is actually stripping calcium from your bones to build bones for your fetus, and is looking for protein like crazy and whatnot. And so this is a time when you're actually trying to gain weight in life because you're trying to help out that fetus, and having a good amount of nutrients, including protein, is obviously very important for that particular thing. But like I said, if you're trying to do some strength training, if you're physically active, you're going to need more protein than the average bear. Some older adults or people recovering from injuries, that's another area that is very good. Even if you're malnourished, I guess I don't have that on that list. If you're malnourished, you may not actually absorb protein very well, so you actually need more of it in order to have enough of it. So people who are malnourished and trying to recover from that, it's important to actually feed them extra protein. I don't think I have on here infection. That's another area. When we're infected, we make antibodies, and we need protein for that as well. So what kind of proteins are Canadians eating? Again, this is from the textbook, and you can see this is giving saying that apparently about 94% of us have some sort of dairy product every day. A lot of us are having different types of meats and eggs and poultries and things like that. And so I want to talk about these protein sources a little bit, and in terms of what are good protein sources. So protein source or protein quality depends on a few different things, but really kind of two main factors. One is digestibility. So notice that animal proteins are top of the list. So high quality protein usually means animal proteins. Legumes are close, and particularly soy products are pretty close to being easily digested as animal proteins. Grains and plants, it ranges quite a bit. For example, oats are a less digestible protein than other types of plants because the fiber in there sort of protects the proteins, and it's hard for the digestive system to kind of get at them. And even depending on how the food is prepared. So notice moist heat. So what do we mean by moist heat? Moist heat is boiling, right? So boiling your meat. Most people don't do that. But if you want to improve digestibility of your meat, that's the way to do it. Dry heat, such as frying, is actually worse, right? And of course, sometimes when you're frying things, you're throwing it in saturated fats as well, and you're adding extra fat to it. In the middle is kind of baking and grilling, right? Is different from frying. So those kind of things can actually change the digestibility of protein. Another thing is, of course, the amino acid composition. High quality protein has all the essential amino acids. And sometimes you may hear that being called complete protein. We'll talk about that in a moment. And it kind of depends on what you're getting in your diet. So let's talk about complete protein. So complete protein is basically when you have all the essential amino acids. Excuse me, my throat. And what are sources of these things? So for the most part, animal products. And so you can see animal products include fish, poultry, beef, pork, also eggs and dairy. Some types of vegetarian products can be considered whole protein, so certain types of soy. Sorry about that. I think I just need a glass of water, perhaps. I'll have to get one in a minute. So certain types of soy are also considered whole protein. So tofu, for example, is maybe the most famous one of that list. So here's the deal. If you are not eating animal products, you may want to have something called complementary proteins. So what does that mean? It means you can get lots of protein from different types of plant products. But what you want to do is eat them in such a way that you're getting all the 9 essential amino acids. And so there's all sorts of different schemes out there on how to do this, right? So you can see in this case here, they're showing some different complementary proteins. So if you eat oatmeal with beans, for example, or rice and beans. Rice and beans, by the way, is people eat that combination all over the world, and you know, some people love it, but it's why are they doing that? Because somehow people figured out a long time ago, you eat these two things together and you're getting a better meal in terms of the protein being complementary to one another. I'll show you some other ones here that I found on the internet. Excuse me again. So this is saying, okay, you know, we want some proteins, and the ones on the left are high in methionine, the ones on the right are higher in lysine. So hey, let's eat these things together, right? So have eggs with your tofu, I guess, or cheese with your chickpeas, or whatever. And like I said, there's lots of schemes for this to try to help out vegetarians and vegans to try to get their complementary proteins. Somehow I had the same slide here twice. I thought I had another, and sometimes these are used. There's a whole bunch of different terms for these kind of things. And like I said, really the concept is that you want to get these complete proteins, right? And here's another one saying, hey, you know, another common strategy to eat legumes with some sort of grain product, and together you're going to get your complete protein. So complementary supplementation, whatever you want to call it, doesn't really matter. What you're trying to do is just get those complete proteins. There's some other schemes there on the internet, so you can see grains plus legumes, legumes plus nuts, grains plus dairy, legumes plus seeds. So there's a huge variety of options. And again, you know, if you're going vegan or vegetarian, or if you are just an eater in general, variety is a good thing to have, to make sure that if you are going to be getting your complete nutrients. But like I said, the big one that people talk about a lot is this one here, grains plus legumes. So beans and rice. So some of you are probably wondering, what is a legume? So it's worth mentioning what a legume is. So legume is a type of plant, okay? And it includes beans and peas and peanuts and lentils and things like that. And you can see there's a diagram there showing on the right what it looks like. The interesting thing about legumes that makes them very special is this thing here, right? So notice in the roots have these nodules, and these nodules, they harbor bacteria, and these bacteria, believe it or not, they pull nitrogen right out of the air. And so these plants actually basically self-fertilize themselves. So they're pulling nitrogen out of the air, they're making nitrites, and they are incorporating those into proteins into the plant. And so these plants tend to be protein rich. And this is a great thing because they are a great source of protein. They're also plants, which means they have fiber and they have minerals and vitamins. Particularly legumes are famous for having B vitamins, iron, and calcium. So these are all great things, particularly if you are a vegetarian or vegan. Iron and calcium are things that you want to make sure that you get a lot of. I'm just looking at my notes, and apparently a cup of legumes is about 20 grams of protein, right? So maybe I'll write that down. So 1 cup of beans is about 20 grams of protein. So what were we saying how much that we needed per day? About 55 grams. So this is, you know, maybe around 30% of your daily value of protein that you need in a day. So that's pretty good. Considering that protein bar I was showing you a few minutes ago was 6 grams, that's almost nothing compared to 20 grams. The quality of soy in particular is almost complete protein. And in many cases, people will compare it with meat and saying it's just as digestible. And in many cases, it is complete protein. Now, I'm not going to say it all the time because there are different soy products and some are better than others. Generally, though, if you're eating legumes and you're supplementing with grains, so beans and rice, people are going to get those complete proteins. Now, keep in mind that legumes tend to be lacking vitamin A, vitamin C, and vitamin B12. And so that's why the grains and the other vegetables are, should be part of the diet. People shouldn't just live off of beans in order to make sure they have a complete diet. The other thing I will say, just one more thing about soy, as I was reading about soy, is apparently, ironically, even though soy has lots of iron, People who eat too much soy actually don't, for some reason, I don't really fully understand this, but there's something that happens to their body, and their body actually absorbs iron less efficiently. So I'm not exactly sure how that works, and probably has something to do with just having a good variety in your diet is important once again. Okay, let me do a time check here. Okay, we are actually doing great for time, exactly where I wanted to be. So there is a scale. Of course, there is. Scientists love doing these things for measuring the quality of protein in foods. It's one of these scales that goes from 0 to 100. It's called the Protein Digestibility Corrected Amino Acid Score. And you can see on this scale, there's a little graph here on the right. We've got eggs, we've got milk, we've got whey protein. That's what you're going to find in those protein shakes. Beef is a little less than 100. So I noticed this scale goes from 0 to 1. It should, anyway, 0 to 100, whatever. And you can see some of these lentils down here are not too bad, kind of in the 80% region and so on. You see oats is getting down here to about 58% or so and whatnot. And so this is something that some people are using in order to kind of look at what they're getting in their diets. But anyway, I probably won't bring this up again because there's a general trend. Like I said, animal proteins tend to be better in terms of quality, followed by soy and other legumes. So let's talk a little bit about protein in food, and that might end up wrapping up where I want to be today. So vegetables, depending on the vegetable, often not a lot of protein, a little bit of protein. So you can see the values here are not very high. Half a cup of corn, 3 grams of protein. Broccoli, 2 grams. Sweet potato, 2 grams. Potato is mostly starch anyway, right? Whether it's sweet potato or not. A little bit of protein in there, so not bad. But generally, this means that fruits and vegetables are not going to be your primary source, and so you're going to want to have other foods in there that are going to give you proteins. So, in terms of grains, there's more proteins in grains, and kind of the general trend is anything that is from a seed. Okay, so beans are seeds, grains are seeds. They tend to be higher sources of proteins from plants. Also higher sources of fats as well, but often the good fats, as we were talking about in the last unit. Fats in general, not a significant source of protein because, of course, fats and oils are usually, for the most part, extracted oils entirely. They're not going to have a lot of protein in it, at least measurable. I thought this was interesting. It says pancakes here. I would argue that it kind of depends on what your pancake is made of. I was looking at pancakes in the store, and I'm of the opinion that pancakes are an indulgence, and they should be made of white flour, and they should be loaded with lots of syrup, and that I'm assuming there's no nutritional value to them. Other people, they make pancakes of a whole wheat flour, and they're putting fruit on them and things like that, and that's a whole different story. So you can imagine the two scenarios I've described are going to be very different in nutrient contents, including protein. So if you're using whole wheat flour for your pancakes or buying a whole wheat flour mix, that is certainly going to have a lot more protein in it than a lot of other things. Bagels, brown rice, and things like that. So generally the whole grain things are going to, and browner flours and whatnot are going to have more protein in them than the white flour and whatnot. So protein foods, we talked about animal products, although this has some nuts and stuff here on here as well. So you can see some examples there: a turkey leg, a chicken breast, pork, tuna, lentils, peanut butter, almonds, hot dogs. So nuts are another good source of proteins, and nuts, of course, are the seeds of a plant. So of course, there's going to be a lot of protein in there. You can see some other examples: cheese and milk and pudding, all dairy products in there. Now, I thought I was just thinking, I guess the legumes are on here kind of here in this area here. So the lentils and peas and beans. I thought soy was on here somewhere, but I guess I don't see it. So keep in mind, like I said before, there's a lot of products out there, and I'm not kicking these products and saying that they're awful to buy a Mars protein bar. Yeah, if you're concerned you're not getting enough protein in your diet and you want to have a chocolate bar, then why not at least go with the one that has extra protein in it? Okay, not too bad. But in terms of what you're looking at, if you want something that is more protein, it's not that hard to find healthier alternatives. These Baby Bells here are fantastic cheeses. I love these things. And if you compare this protein bar, it's 10 grams of protein, whereas the Baby Bells, these 3 Baby Bells have 15 grams in them, right? And it costs less. So just something to think about, right? Here's another example of another protein bar product or whatever these things are, Oat Bites. And you know what? About the same amount of protein in those as a bowl of pasta. And you know what is probably going to do your body better is eating the pasta, right? So anyway, just something to think about, right, when you're looking at these products, because they're you can get protein from eating actual food as opposed to processed products. Here's another one just talking about plant protein and animal protein, which is something I'm going to talk about eventually is vegetarianism, which I don't think I'm going to get to today. But just a reminder, right, you can get lots of protein from these plant products. Just keep in mind a variety is good because we do want to make sure you have complete. And if you go to this this guy's blog, he talks about you know, there's certainly enough people out there in the fitness world that are trying to get away from animal products. And he's saying, you know, there's nothing wrong with animal products eaten in moderation, just like anything. And many of them, in fact, are really high quality protein and should be encouraged. So we will, like I said, we will talk about vegetarianism at some point. I guess that will be next day. So this is where I wanted to have the cutoff, by the way, for today and for what is going to be on the midterm. There are some other things that I do want to talk about. I want to talk about gluten, and I want to talk about vegan and vegetarian diets. And I was pretty sure I was not going to get to them today. And I'm looking at the clock. There's only about 5 minutes left, and it's not really worth getting into those things at the moment. So this is where the cutoff is going to be for the midterm material. So it's covering topics 1 to 6, although 1 to 6 up to this point. So the vegetarian vegan stuff is basically going to be, I guess it'll be on the final exam. So what I am going to do though, is I am going to make quiz number 6 visible. It doesn't have, I don't think I put any questions about the vegetarian vegan stuff on it. You should be able to answer all the questions. But you don't have to. It's not due 1 week from now. I think I have it due March 2nd or something like that. But if it's something that you feel you would like to do before the midterm, then it is there available for you to do now, after you've reviewed your topic 6 notes. If not, if you want to wait till after the reading week to do quiz number 6, that is also an option for you. But I figure I'd make that available for you. Thought I had another announcement to make. I guess that's it. I guess the other announcement is that I'm still waiting to hear back from the college in terms of what is going on after reading week. I've heard back from my department, and basically what has happened is the administration has asked the departments for feedback on whether we want to go to in-person classes or whether online, and then they're going to make a decision, and apparently they meet on Wednesdays. So I'm hoping that there will be an announcement today or tomorrow about what's going to happen after reading week. I will just say this on my end, that whatever the announcement is, I will also email the class to reiterate what is going to go on in terms of that. So please stay tuned for any announcements. Good luck on your midterm. I hope you have a wonderful break away from classes, and that you get, you know, whatever you need to have done, some rest or some schoolwork or whatever, that you do all that, and I'll see you when you get back.